because when I was asked for a topic, and I thought, well, let's get back to basics, and said, all right, I will teach on the Four Noble Truths. I hadn't appreciated that, of course, the Four Noble Truths were first taught at the Deer Park in Sarnath. So when this was pointed out, I felt that indeed this was a very auspicious connection here. So, all right, how many of you do not know anything about Buddhism or Four Noble Truths? Okay, how many of you do? So let's start right back at the beginning with the Buddha. Now, the Buddha, as I'm sure all of you do know, was a prince in northern India on the Nepal, what is nowadays the Nepal border, born into the tribe of the Sakyas. And for this reason, he later became known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Sakyas. Shakya was his tribal name. And his father apparently was a king of that, a Maharaj of that area. And when the Buddha was born, at that time he was named Siddhartha. And the family name was Gautama, so he's called Siddhartha Gautama. And when he was born, it was prophesied that either he would become a fully enlightened Buddha or he would become a wheel-turning monarch. He would become a very important king. So of course his father wanted him to be a king and was horrified at the thought that he might renounce the kingdom and go out. And he was the only son. Apparently he was the only child in that family, and his mother, Mahamaya, she passed away 1 week after his birth. And so he was brought up by his aunt and stepmother, Mahaprajapati. So the king did everything according to traditional accounts. The king did everything to keep the prince happy. And he had 3 palaces for the 3 different times of the year, the hot season, the monsoon season, the cold season. And only very beautiful young people were allowed to serve in the palace. And once you were old or sick, you were shunted out the way, according to traditional accounts. Which would explain why, when the Buddha grew up and he felt he needed to go beyond the palace, he wanted to go out. And when he went out, he saw an old man, and he didn't know what's the problem with this guy. And his attendant said, well, he's old. And he said, old? And he said, yeah, you know, we all get old. Every day we're getting older. Oh, you mean I'm going to be like that? Yes, yes, we all do. And then he saw a sick man being carried along. And again, he was very shocked. You mean to say we can get ill? And then he saw a corpse and understood that the fate of all beings is to die. And so this was very powerful for him, because up to that time it appears he hadn't really, even if he had seen old and sick people before, hadn't really absorbed it. And then the last time he went out, fortunately, he saw a recluse, like a sadhu or swami, and recognized that this person was striving to go beyond old age, sickness and death, to reach to that realm of existence beyond all that. So, of course, later he left the palace, and his wife and his small child, his family, everything, and went forward. He practiced austerities for some years with 5 companions, and then recognizing that this was just the other extreme of his overindulgence before, then he accepted milk rice, sat under the Bodhi tree after all his disciples had deserted him for being overindulgent, and through the watches of the night gradually attained enlightenment in what is now called Bodhgaya. I'm mentioning all this because then after his enlightenment, you see, he spent some time sitting under trees, and then he was requested to teach. And at first he said, no, my teaching is too subtle, no one will understand it. And he was assured that there were some with little dust in their eyes, they would understand it. So then he went to Saranath and met his erstwhile students and set in motion the wheel of the Dharma. That means he gave his first talk to his erstwhile companions. And what he talked about was these 4 Noble Truths. So the 4 Noble Truths are the foundation of the Buddhist path, really. Now, if you think about the Buddha's enlightenment, according to traditional accounts, on the first watch of the night, he went through all his past births, thousands and thousands of births in the past. Then in the second watch of the night, his mind opened still further, and he saw it coming into being and departing and coming into being of all the beings in the universe. And in the third watch of the night, he understood the interconnectedness and what causes that we endlessly coming into birth and death, and how it's all interconnected. So this is called interdependent origination. And when the Buddha understood what was the actual fundamental point at which afterwards everything else goes into play, and how they're all interconnected with each other. At that point, he said, now I know I am a Buddha. He felt he had understood everything, the very inner structure of how it all fits together. But then he felt this was so difficult, so against the way people were thinking in those days, and those days were the days of Vedic ritual, that nobody would understand, and it would just be a weariness to even try. But then the gods Brahma and Indra, according to the accounts, came and offered him a golden wheel, and said to him, please turn in the wheel of the Dharma out of benefit for all beings. So then he went to Saranath and he taught this wheel. The point is that having spent countless lifetimes striving for Buddhahood in the past, finally he had got it. Finally he understood. His mind completely opened up, vast. He understood whatever there was to understand, he understood. So you might expect that when he started talking, he would talk about, bliss and emptiness, and the nature of the mind, and all sorts of luminosity, and all these sort of fantastic, qualities which come with the enlightened mind. But what he talked about was dukkha. Dukkha, dukkha, dukkha. Dukkha is the Sanskrit word which is usually translated as suffering. But suffering, in a way, is too strong a word in English. we can easily say, I'm not suffering, I'm fine. Dukkha is the opposite of sukha. And sukha means happiness, but it also means a kind of ease. You know, when everything's okay, when everything's going well, it's sukha. And so dukkha is dis-ease. It's the fact that everything is not quite right. Everything would be wonderful if only. But there's always an if only. There's that underlying dissatisfaction in our lives, which makes everybody try so hard for happiness. And yet with all the amount of effort and time and money and thought we put into being happy, normally people still feel a sense of dis-ease inside, that something's not quite right, that there's something which is not satisfied within us. So the Buddha was starting with this whole question of the fact that essentially leading our lives the way we do, in our delusion, we're sick. We are diseased. The Buddha described himself as the supreme physician. He's the great doctor. He looks at us all in our unenlightened state and says, wow, you're really sick. And then, second noble truth, there's a reason, there's a cause for being sick. One of the problems in going to hospitals in India is very often the doctors will say, oh yes, and give you some medicine, but you come out and you say to them, well, what's the reason? What's the cause? What's the problem? And they don't know, the doctors didn't tell them. Just take this medicine. But actually, if we are sick, we want to know what's the sickness. And then we want to know what caused that. And third noble truth, we want to know there's a cure. So the Buddha didn't say that we are inherently sick. Inherently, we are totally healthy. But in the meantime, we have fallen into being unwell for a long, long time. But good news, fourth noble truth, there's a cure. There's a cure. Follow the cure and we return to our inherent healthiness, our inherent state of healthiness again. So this is the Four Noble Truths. It's dealing with dukkha, this state of unease and dissatisfaction which runs through all our lives. The reason why we are in this state, the fact that we can go beyond that to a state of total spiritual health, and the way to do this. Very detailed explanations of how to become healthy, what regime we have to undertake to become back to our natural state of healthiness again. So this morning we will deal with dukkha a little bit, because it's very important to recognize if we're sick that we're sick, and denying it doesn't help, because then the sickness spreads out throughout our whole body. If we can recognize that there's a problem there and go to a good doctor and get yourself cured, then that makes much more sense than being in a state of denial and thinking that I'm okay really and I'll manage. So therefore, the first emphasis is on accepting that there is something wrong. When I was I was brought up in a really very nice kind of family background. I mean, I tried very hard, but I can't think of anything traumatic that ever happened to me as a child. I mean, I lost my father when I was 2, but I don't remember him, so he didn't come into the picture. My mother was very capable, and I had an older brother. And although we were poor, and it was just after the war, actually we were a very harmonious family. There was nothing wrong. I was, averagely intelligent, nothing brilliant, but not too stupid. And I enjoyed my school, I had nice teachers, there was nothing wrong. And in those days, also living in London was not the violent place it's become today. It was, we all left our doors open. So outwardly I was perfectly happy. And I remember one evening I went to visit my uncle and aunt, who were also very pleasant people. And we had a very pleasant evening with them. And then my mother and I were waiting for the bus to go home. And suddenly I realized, I was about 13 at this time, I saw all these buses going by and people sitting there reading, looking out the window, talking to each other, sleeping. It was night. And so the buses were all lit up. And I thought, all these people are going to get old. They'll get sick. They'll die. Life is suffering. And it hit me here. I thought, it's like being on a train that you know is going to crash, but you don't know when it's going to crash. How can you just spend your time looking out the window? And I remember my heart was beating with this shock of recognizing that every single person, if they didn't die beforehand, would get old, would get sick, and then they're going to die. All of us. And I said to my mother, life is suffering. And she, who had had a lot of trouble in her life, said, well, yeah, there are hard things, but there are good things too. And I thought, no, that's not the point. Underlying it is this whole condition. It is so insecure. We don't know when we're going to get sick. We don't know when we're going to get died. Why are we wasting our time? Unfortunately, I didn't meet with a sadhu walking down the road. This was a bit left out. And so it took quite a bit of time to come to the land of sadhus. But the first bit I got, and it really worried me a lot for some time, just that whole insecurity of our life, and how nobody wanted to recognize that there was a problem there. Now, of course, most people in our lives, we want to be happy, and people have various ideas on where happiness lies. But mostly, if you think about it, people mostly think that happiness, it depends on having comforts for the body. I was talking with someone recently, and they were saying that they had started watching their minds and discovered that 80 to 85% of their thoughts were dwelling on physical comfort, which they had never realized before. Food, clothing, heat, cold, health, all the body, keeping keeping the body happy. And such a small part of their mind, they recognized, was dealing with really making their mind healthy and comfortable. We are animals. And animals, if you look at them, I mean, we have dogs and, you know, cats and so forth. What are they thinking about? What are they thinking about? You know, they're thinking about food. If they're not neutered, they're thinking about sex. They're thinking about lying in the sun to keep warm, or in the winter curling up somewhere else to keep warm. And, you know, they like to be made a fuss of. If, you know, if people show them affection, they're very happy. And so that's, you know, that is part of their animal instinct. Like all beings, they don't want to be hurt. They don't want to be cold. They don't want to be starving any more than we would. And I mean, to my mind, if people's main thoughts are about being physically comfortable and having nice food and satisfying sexual relationships and genuinely just having a very nice, comfortable physical time in this world, then it would make a lot of sense to be reborn as a pet dog in America. Because then you have no worries. You don't have to even go out to work to get all these things. You just have to sit around, wag your tail, and everybody loves you. You don't have to have witty conversation. You don't have to go through exams. You know. In their way, these dogs have very happy, very pampered lives. In New York, there are probably 3 times more pet shops than there are beauty shops. If you look along, every other shop seems to be a pet shop. Mind you, what these pet looks like after they've gone through these shops. You're embarrassed for them, but you know, because also now less and less people are having children, so they get into having animals instead. And the animals are totally pampered. They don't go off on drug binges, or, you know, they're not insulting their parents and blaming all their problems on them or anything. I mean, they're always welcome. What's wrong? Total unconditioned love. Well, conditioned, you've got to feed them, but... So, the question is, wherein does happiness lie? Because people, they spend so much time trying to satisfy their needs. What did the Buddha say is dukkha? The Buddha said dukkha, he defined it as, first of all, birth. The fact that we're here creates problems right from the start. So birth, old age, sickness, death. Not getting what we want. Getting what we don't want. And then he said, in brief, the whole of conditioned existence is dukkha. So we spend a lot of our time trying to maneuver things so that we get what we want and we don't get what we don't want. And people are always doing a lot of very shifty footwork to create the kind of conditions, mostly external conditions, which they are hoping will fulfill, give her a sense of satisfaction. So, you know, a lot of the emphasis, and especially in our modern society, is on the outer satisfaction of our desires. Of course, speaking to an audience like you is very different from speaking to an audience in New York, because all of you have given up a lot to come here. And so you already understand that mere external conveniences and comforts are not so likely to lead to the inner satisfaction that we believe they might, which our society assures us they will. But nonetheless, even if it's not the gross satisfaction of desires, bigger houses, bigger cars, bigger TVs, and so forth, still we tend to, wherever we are, create an ambience which we hope will give us a sense of satisfaction and pleasure. The problem is that, as the Buddha said, desire, greed, is like drinking salty water. And the more we drink, the thirstier we become. So that one could drink the whole ocean and still be thirsty. And I think our society, in some ways, we're very fortunate because we can see this now, where there are many people who have the means to buy just about anything they could possibly want. And there's never a point at which they say, well, that's enough now. It's never enough, because there's always something else. And in our modern society, they are regularly producing something else. Someone was remarking yesterday, what's the use of buying a new computer? Next week they're going to come out with an even bigger model. You know, it's always, however much we think we can catch up with everything we want, next time we look, there's something else. And then there's something else. And then there's something else. And then we have to create the money to buy these something else's. And so then that's another source of worry and stress. And, you know, especially, as you know, in the West, people are working so hard. Even in Delhi, we went to a bank, and this poor guy, he was working from 8 in the morning till about 10 or 11 at night, every night. What for? To get on. And so that time of life when our minds are the most open and bright and clear is totally thrown away on this you know, inherently futile grasping at you know, financial and social progress, and working. For what? The point is that, you know, inside us there is this huge, great big black hole, which we are endlessly trying to fill. We're trying to fill it with things, we try to fill it with people, relationships, children, family, friends, houses, cars, clothing, gadgets, status. Pour it in. At some point we're going to feel filled and satisfied. But it's a black hole. No matter what we have, no matter how successful, we may appear to others, inside there is still a sense of lack. And it's this sense of lack that the Buddha meant by dukkha. I mean, we may be very healthy, we may be, financially secure, we may be in a beautiful relationship, living in a beautiful place, but still there is that sense that everything would be all right if only. There's always something. What in common parlance is called the fly in the ointment. The ointment's beautiful, but there's a fly in it. And if we examine our lives, we see that this is true. It's just going to be okay, but never exactly quite now. Or if it is now, then there's a fear we're going to lose it. Because also people get into a state where everything has come together beautiful, it's very serendipitous, but, it can't last. So this sense of that somehow, however hard we try for happiness, however hard we try to arrange the conditions to suit us, it doesn't work. This is a very important point to understand, because once we have recognized that outward conditions can never be perfect because we live in a very imperfect society, then we start to ask, well, where is the cure? Actually, most of you are coming from fairly affluent backgrounds and are educated. And so this is a very big advantage. It's a big advantage because we all know people who have so much, and yet, usually they're not that happy. I mean, why is it that so many millionaires and millionaires become alcoholics? If they've got everything, click their fingers, and everybody will kowtow to them and run around and organize everything, and yet you meet them. I mean, I've met some very, very, very wealthy people, including, like people, the top people in Microsoft. And they were very nice people, but I wouldn't say they were particularly happy. They seemed to be quite tense. And they certainly drank a lot. So, even when we are in a situation where all our external circumstances have been created to fit us. Our wardrobes are full of clothing. We have the latest high-tech everything. We have private jets. We have endless money. But inside, the feeling inside is quite different. The sense inside could care less about high technology and all these things, actually. This is all very, very external. It doesn't have anything to do with our happiness. Buddhism talks a lot about suffering, sickness, death, impermanence, endless impermanence. The best thing offered to you is called emptiness. So by rights, Buddhists should be a right gloomy lot. And I think that one of the things which strikes people when they actually go to Buddhist countries, real Buddhist countries, is how cheerful everybody is. In fact, one of the first books on Thailand was called Land of Smiles. And in one of the first editions of the Tibetan dictionary was written by Christian Moravian missionaries who lived in Lahul and Ladakh in the late 19th century. And in the introduction it says, well, of course, the people of the Tibet and Himalayan regions are very cheerful, good-hearted, kind, honest, and compassionate. But how much more if only they had gotten the true gospel? So, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, why are these people who are endlessly meditating on death and impermanence happy, cheerful, and compassionate? But the point is that if we really face the fact that life is dukkha, it's an enormous relief. One time, when I was, the first year I was living in my cave, all that winter it had not snowed, which was actually very bad because it meant that the springs from which the rivers flow down to the rest of India were drying up and the glaciers were going backwards, so it was not a good thing at all. Anyway, they did the local lamas went to the springs and did Naga pujas, and after that, in May, it snowed abundantly for a week. But by this time the ground had unfrozen because it was now May, and so all the water came through. So my cave was completely soaking with water. It was dripping in all directions. And I was living in a little gum tree. It was just a bit like this, except it was higher, but about this size. And so I had to move it to the only place which wasn't dripping too much. And so it was very cold, it was snowing. I was sitting in this here, in my box. And I had flu, so I felt horrible. And I remember sitting there. Feeling very sorry for myself, thinking indeed they're right about living in caves, not such a good idea. And just sitting there feeling very gloomy. And then I thought, wait a minute, didn't the Buddha say something about dukkha? So, this is dukkha. Okay, no problem. And as soon as I recognized that the dukkha was not the problem, it was the resistance to dukkha that was the problem, it was like a big sack of rocks just fell off my back. Sometimes things go nicely, that's nice. Sometimes things do not go nicely, that's okay too. What do you expect? This is samsara. Samsara means the round of birth and death, and it's often compared to an ocean. And in an ocean, waves go up, waves go down. It's the nature of the ocean. So sometimes things go well, sometimes things go extremely unwell. But that's the nature of life. The problem is not so much what happens to us. The problem is how we react to what happens to us. If we resent it and resist, when things do not go as I want them to go, then there's a double suffering. The Buddha said there are two kinds of suffering. There is physical suffering, like when we're sick or in an accident, or we're hot and we're cold. That is unavoidable. As long as we have a human body, we are going to have some problems with it. But the second dukkha is mental dukkha. And that is avoidable. I'm sick. So, I can be very unhappy about being sick, and then you get double dukkha. Or I can accept that I'm sick, and it's natural for the body to be sick, and maybe I will be cured, maybe I won't, but this is the way it is. And you just relax within that, and then your mind is okay. So this is the point. This is the whole point, is that physical dukkha we cannot escape from. While we have a body, there is going to sometimes be dukkha. We all get old. Moment to moment to moment to moment. Even you young ones are going to get old. You think it will never happen. It happens. It happens, and then suddenly you say, see, everybody thinks you're old, and inside you don't feel old at all. But then you look in the mirror and you go, ooh, who's that? So that's natural. That's no problem. It's only a problem if you resent being old, if you're afraid of being old, if you're always trying to make yourself look young. If you read all those stupid magazines, which somehow inform you that you're a non-person once you get over 40, especially if you look like you're over 40. When you're 40, you're supposed to look 25. For some reason, 25 is better than 40, which is nonsense. No, think about it, isn't it? Because in more sensible, traditional societies, the older you get, the more you are respected. Because it's assumed that you have gained experience and some kind of wisdom and understanding with your old age. Therefore, the older you get, the more you would be honored and respected, not thrown aside as though now you're a worn-out pair of shoes. And this is another example of how our contemporary society is totally screwed up. Because they worship out of things. And since we're all going to get old, unless you die beforehand, then it's something serious to think about. You know, I mean, you cannot remain young forever, however many facelifts. You just look like an old person with lots of facelifts. Pathetic, actually. So the point is that we are going to get old. We are almost certainly going to get sick at some points. And we can make that into something very distressing